Welcome to the virtual Creative Morning stage, Eric.
So I thought I would begin, it's kind of like a comedian coming out and saying, how's everyone doing? It's kind of the one-liner that you don't want to use right away. But I thought, it's actually pretty important to talk about as I've been reflecting on design process and the evolution of how I practice and the beliefs of what architecture has the power to be in these polarized times as an influencer into our daily lives. So per my introduction, I'm from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is pretty much in central eastern Pennsylvania. You can see on the map there to the right. It's about an hour and a half north of Philadelphia, and it's actually about an hour and 15 to the southwest of New York City. So growing up, the picture to the left, which is actually a photograph by Joseph Elliott, it's a local photographer in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, really speaks volumes to what I remember Bethlehem, Pennsylvania looking like when I was growing up. You're situated in this valley, which has these amazing rolling hills, just flanked by the Appalachian Mountains. And so you could always go out into nature. It was very lush and very green. But at the heart of the city, and actually pretty much through middle of growing up there until I was 17, the Bethlehem Steel was the main attractor of this place, and it had a long history of bringing people to the city, and at the same time influenced the city in many ways, whether it be physically by the buildings that were there or simply by the canal landscape that was there as well. So everything was rooted around the steel, and in 2001 the steel actually closed, and so in a lot of ways, it became a good thing that when I was outside playing, I would not see the big black clouds that would be created by the Bethlehem Steel. But at the same time, I was recognizing that something was missing socially. Here's some of the textures of the town. And at the time when I was growing up, I was heading out to New York City and heading out to Philadelphia and seeing these urban centers and these urban cores with these new buildings. And of course, there was this social dialogue, but what I wasn't realizing was how important this aging and this patina was to my life and my upbringing, and ultimately my understanding of place and identity. On the top, this is a really prominent, famous photograph done by Walker Evans, which is taken in 1935 of the graveyard that overlooks South Bethlehem, which is right along where most of the workers had lived from the Bethlehem Steel. And then in 2008, a similar photograph was taken in the cemetery. And you can see that really from that 70 years, there's not that much change. And actually today, visiting the city, there's subtle changes in the social constructs of the place, but physically it still manifests the same way, which is really, really intriguing that it's one of those blue collar cities almost stuck in time. And this is where it became really important and interesting. A lot of the structures, these hard steel, long warehouse buildings, are now being overtaken by the landscape. And so this is really impactful in a couple ways. One, socially now, what used to work as sort of these elements that define the place have a new life, a new beginning. Maybe not physically being used or utilized by workers or a job, but they're still there. They resonate with the place. They resonate with the people that are still living who have worked there. But as all things, time is inevitable, right? And sort of this new uprising and this new growth always takes over and provides a platform on which to build from. And that's what Bethlehem is currently doing right now. And if we look at that, we see this idea of the original impetus and the variational impetus, which is, we had this rise in Bethlehem from the late 1800s into the 1900s, where it was about the Bethlehem Steel. And then today, seeing that variation, the sons and daughters and the grandchildren of those original workers still living out in that area. But what becomes really interesting, and actually this quote speaks to it a little bit, is what we do depends on who we are. Of course, that's, obviously rooted in the place, but it is necessary to add also that we are, to a certain extent, what we do, and that we are creating ourselves continually. So this idea that there's this constant evolution of defining ourselves, defining this place, and defining the natural stimuli that creates that identity is what becomes really interesting when you begin to study these cities around North America. So I thought I would just really quickly talk about some of the work that I do and how all this sort of begins to translate into the manifestation of design and buildings, and also my process, which this project here we'll get into. It's actually one of the last slides that I want to talk about in terms of the social implications of this project and why it matters to look at that rather than just create a building. So this is a project at Scottsdale Community College. It's a business school and indigenous cultural center that I worked on at the firm Architecton where I work, which is, you can see this process and this identity beginning to form through material, studies and plan. There's user group meetings, and then trying to define an identity that resonates with place. And obviously the final photographs here. And we're going to talk about this one more at length. This is a project, this is a UEB construction offices in Scottsdale, Arizona. This is actually in an old brick building that used to be an LDS meeting house. So translating the language of place, you can actually see it on the top left there, an original rendering. So it kind of looks like a church, but how do you create identity that's new, but at the same time take into stock the old and begin to malleable sort of conversation of how to create spaces within a construct that's already defined. And so we did that through really having a hands-off approach of not allowing ourselves to add too much to the building without taking away, our own perceived social and physical constructs identity, allowing the building to kind of have the final say as to what it wanted to be. So really only implementing materials as necessary or as highlighters or contrasters to the overall building form. And then if you've taken a drive down 32nd Street recently, just south of Camelback, this is the Helios Education Foundation, which is a project that should serve as a new case study for office buildings within Arizona. Obviously, this one, beyond it being an amazing looking building, the real story here is the social identity of an office place in Phoenix. So looking at, what actually drives the 35-mile-per-hour building, because that's so many of our buildings in Phoenix. How does that identity begin to work for us in this city? What materials are most appropriate? How does a courtyard translate into a public perception, but at the same time allow us to perceive a space in an entirely new way, in a responsible way for energy and sustainability? And this project's just finishing up completion, but here are some of the photographs of that. If you do get a chance to drive down 32nd Street, drive at 35 miles per hour, that's the speed limit, and you'll be able to begin to see what I'm talking about and how the building engages with you at that level. And then also, if you ever go inside, you can engage at it at a different scale. So let's begin talking about spectrums. I talked a little bit about the lens in which I look at design, but I think now the goal of this presentation is to talk through a spectrum or a listing of ideas to ultimately gather and perform these tangibles that need to be delivered, whether it be a building or whether it be a design, but at the same time, look at a spectrum in terms of a classification of identities, whether it be through diversity, social construct, or eras of design for precedent research. So spectrum definition is simply used to classify something, right? Or suggest that it can even be classified. And this is where I'm going to have a little bit of fun, because I'm actually going to talk about some things that can't be classified, or our minds actually play tricks on us on, to engage us a little bit further in the evolution of design. And then, of course, another way to think about it, which I'm going to avoid, which is these polarized opposites. We're dealing enough with polarized opposites and extreme points and not meeting in the middle with politics these days, so I'm going to leave it with that. But I think along that spectrum line, I want to look at this as a focal point in terms of curiosity, because whether you're at one end of the spectrum or the other, that middle should serve in the creative realm of driving curiosity. So if we were looking at this quote, in that sort of realm of creation, you're needing to be concerned, right? Asking these questions of what is driving my decision making? How am I thinking about this? Why am I thinking about this? Is this important? Asking the right questions. Thinking about the care for what exists currently, right? And that's not to be overshadowed by looking at what is there and what should remain there based off of singular point descriptions of what we think identity means for that place, but allowing it to naturally occur and what should exist for that time period and those people. And I'll go back to that a little bit in the precedent research that we have in the presentation later. Curiosity should also talk about a readiness to find strange and singular what surrounds us. So these oddities, these moments, these hopeful moments that create humor in our lives, these are these additives that add variation, which goes into the next point of a certain relentlessness to break up our familiarities. So, you know, complacency, as we all know in design, is a killer. Living a complacent life only gives you a narrow-minded view. But I think what becomes really important in your observation state when you're looking out for these new dichotomies in the spectrum of design is to really figure out how to break up those objects, those fixations from the day-to-day. A fervor to grasp what is happening and what passes. So this is a point that we're going to kind of go through a little bit later and expand upon, but it is really, really important to understand that things and time keep evolving and going, but we don't necessarily have to make things stay for the rest of time, right? That we actually find beauty in allowing the process and time to pass us over. And then the last one, which is a casualness in regard to the traditional hierarchies of the important and essential. So again, this one becomes a little convoluted, right? Because you can almost inflict your personal viewpoints or goals within the overall design, which becomes dangerous, right? Any infliction when you're talking about a building serving the public and making that about yourself is kind of a no-no. But in other creative realms, certainly can be a point to be had within your own curiosity. So I've broken up the talk into three major points. They all have to do with material itself, the social investigations, and visual identities. And so the graphic to the left is actually the human field of view. So if you don't know, the human view extends 180 degrees from the left to the right and 150 degrees up and down, which becomes really, really interesting in that, you know, we don't have a full 360-degree spectrum, right? We don't have that within our own eyes, and we don't have that in the world, right? We're never going to fill in those missing pieces just by one element alone. So how do we constantly sense the other 180 degrees, 210 degrees of our environment? And to do this, we need to understand that it needs to work in tandem with memory. So each of these points is how to define your identity through using your mind and filling in the gaps. For our visual scope to be useful, we must assume a certain truth about the space out of view or hidden behind us based on past events. So we're constantly filling that in with our own narrative and storyline. So the first point that I'm going to talk about is material engagement. So we're going to evaluate material as a sort of classification of buildings in the built environment. And we're going to move into that and how it intensifies the social agenda, right? So how people perceive it, but at the same time, hopefully creating a dialogue around it to influence our own stories. And then the last one, which will be a project that I'll take you through, it's the Scottsdale Community College project, talking about a narrative where the social and the material investigations create this polarized design evolution that was curated through the process of creating the project itself. So I know this is a lot on the slide, but it's pretty simple. So when we're looking at this, we're talking about material and our understanding of material. So within material, and again, I'm talking about, you know, whether it's a brick, whether it's stone, whether it's, you know, aluminum, what have you. I'm talking about how you actually create something from a built manifestation or an object. So within that, we have making, images, and language, right? Each byproducts of that characteristic. So we use these tools in architecture, being that of drawing, to create and decipher our own thoughts and also convey them to the public in order to be built, in order to be funded, in order to portray what's coming, to hopefully gain the attention of the public, but at the same time make sure that we're really protecting the safety and welfare of the public themselves in which we'll use the buildings. So again, the idea of material itself, though, and buildings themselves is categorized by this quote that's on the top right of the screen, highlighted in yellow, which is that it's the temporally emergent property of material engagement. It's the ongoing blending between the mental and the physical. So again, we're talking about materials when we're thinking about our minds sort of going into this realm of filling in the blanks. And so if an example of that would be on the bottom right of the screen there, where we have to the left clay, which is what a brick's made out of. But there's this malleability to clay, right, that it doesn't exactly give us an idea of how to use it for a built feature because it hasn't become a brick yet. So, you know, I think from one polarized end to the other, when we're thinking about this, how do we begin to utilize the squeezing the lump of the clay with its malleability and perhaps not a known form to recognize the fact that we should be more in this state from day one in a design process rather than looking at the brick, which already has its own identity and we're just creating upon it. And so there's no better way to kind of experiment with this more than with this illusion. And this illusion is named after Ludemar Herman, and it's known as the Herman Grid. So if you're looking at this, you're probably noticing that you see some black dots as you scan over it, but it's actually a series of black squares lined up perfectly on a white background. There is no black dot. And when observed with the naked eye, any section of the grid not focused on will appear to have a gray dot at the center of the white space. And this is because, you know, your eye can shift to where the gray dot is, but the gray spot will be gone as soon as you look to another area where two white planes line up. So this effect is often explained by a neural process called lateral inhibition. The intensity at a point in the visual system is not simply the result of a single receptor, but the result of a group of receptors which respond to the presentation of stimuli in what is called a receptive field. So in a way, this becomes really interesting in that how do we begin to look at these receptors coming together to identify an object in space, and how do we use that same identity into the process of gathering information to create buildings so that people are filling in the gaps to create ultimately an outcome that works for that time period and those people. So we have a lot of visual stimuli, right, in our world today, and we actually take quite a lot of pleasure in this. So to the left, you'll actually see Anderson Cooper with his new wax figure that was released, I think, a few years ago for that museum in New York. So, you know, beyond lateral inhibition, it's not just a byproduct of Herman's grid. So we navigate through these simulated conditions constantly. So you can imagine that we actually go to a wax museum because we want to be stimulated by that in which is not real. But where does that begin to pose a problem in our real world, with our buildings, with our environments? If you've ever driven your car, and perhaps it's that everyday, well, we're not doing it now, but that everyday drive to work, and you leave your home and you go to work and you completely forget about that middle part, which is that drive. How many times do we live in that stimulated augmented reality where we're just going through the motions? That is the most dangerous place to be in when you're trying to design anything. And it's starting to actually manifest itself into a material quality. So on the top right, this is a simulated brick. And what I mean by that is it's actually a panelized brick. They come in sheets. You can place them down, and so they're not hand laid individually like, you know, the singular sort of brick like you see on the bottom right. That's the real brick. And although at first glance, we're not noticing anything that different between the two, the inevitability of time and wear is where the simulated brick falls apart, because what we expect from a brick is unevenness, the ability for plants to grow up in between each brick. And so this simulated sort of stigma that we have in the built realm is becoming ever more increasing our visual stimuli in cities. And you'll see it even in downtown Phoenix with the new apartment buildings and also the materials being used that, you know, they're used because they're cheap and they're used because they last for a really long time. But at the same time, I think what we're forgetting is that there's beauty in the patina. A great example of this, and probably a modern interpretation of this, again, goes back to the social and the physical realm of the Parthenon. And so people travel to Athens from all around the world to go to the Acropolis and see the Parthenon. And this is an object kind of fixed in Western civilization in our imagination as to what it should be. But many are surprised to see that when they go there, that this is an ongoing construction site. It's a conglomerate of marble and newly added titanium with freshly cut ashlar, lacking the patina of age, but acting as a comprehensible spatial form in which to affix our assumptions and beliefs. And so we're creating this dialogue with architecture that no longer exists just because we think it should, because we've been told that it's been there and we think that it's important. The Parthenon is only tolerable to us, worth something to us, if it only confirms our cultural illusion of what architecture should be. And so how many times have we seen this in the newspaper or in magazine articles, or Notre Dame is a really good example, that, you know, we're fixated on restoring, and we're fixated on these ideas of buildings, but what we're forgetting about is that, you know, there's this passing of time that ultimately has a dialogue into the aesthetic of place. And so we approach the Parthenon with a prejudice, and it's this prejudice that we approach all of architecture with. And it's this idea that architecture must be coherent inside and outside, a form, a body. But there's really no more interesting thing than a ruin itself, kind of slated in its own modernity. So my take on this personally, and the take on a lot of architects, hopefully here in the future, is that we preserve civilization through knowledge and not through the act of replicating. And actually, there's a really interesting dialogue to be had too, an argument as to why we should be not replicating with new materials, but at the same time using the old materials to create a new. So to the right, you'll see new material and design. That is thinking about utilizing all new materials always for buildings within the embodied energy of a building. And to the left, that's old material and design. And you can actually see that if we were to reuse material from building stock currently, rather than try to replace with new material and meld the two together, that reusing material averages a 35% life cycle embodied energy savings. So there's actually an argument to be made onto why we should actually be thinking about reusing materials, but not utilizing new materials to re-emerge the old. And there are a lot of other studies. The recession is good for a lot of things, but one of them in 2008 and 2010 was that a lot of architects were using this time to research new materials done by the recycling of existing materials. So on the left is magnesite, there's thermocork, and there's crushed recycled glass tile. These are only 3 of probably thousands of options now within the architect's book of materials that they can now use. But what becomes really interesting about this is that rather than just thinking about singularly a material like a brick or, let's say, a vinyl, that you now have these recycled components that were of existing building stock that you can reuse in many ways. But at the same time, I mean, look at the color quality, look at the materiality. You're almost given this idea that you can create something entirely new and not before perceived. And how do you begin to do that, and what are some examples? So if we look to this pavilion created in Germany, it's done by the University of Stuttgart. They're actually utilizing not only new material, but also utilizing machines rather than the human to build it, right? Because the material itself warrants the idea that we have to reconstruct and re-identify the way in which we create. Another example of this, you've probably seen from MoMA PS1, it's the Mushroom Tower done by David Benjamin. And we actually used on this, it's a familiar material, right? So we're looking at using mushroom, the byproduct, and actually going in there and forming these concave and sort of concrete bricks that are stacked to create this pavilion. You can see the quality of architecture that's created by that, this sort of intangible moments of the sun hitting something that previously didn't exist, that is just a byproduct. So kind of moving in from material, how does the material itself begin to intensify our social understanding of it? So we're adopting this sort of new reality that we have technology at our forefront constantly. But the question is, are we allowing that to sort of jade our understanding of place? In the last, 100 years, 200 years, we're looking at these two words, complexity and elegance. And complexity and elegance have had a long history into the dialogue of architecture, but probably more so design in general. And ever increasingly, we're kind of heightening the word complexity, and we're getting below the sort of trend line on elegance. And that becomes a really important dialogue when we're thinking about, are we overthinking design itself? Are we getting away from the rooted problems of, not having this, large carbon footprint or these large, uncomprehensible buildings that become so complex that no longer are they, sort of relatable to the human mind? Now, that isn't to say that not all sort of complexity is bad, right? And it's not to our fault that we're glued to our phones in a lot of situations. I mean, the picture to the right, the social media use in the subway. I mean, subways are pretty, visually not compelling at all. So, to be on there with another stimuli that actually attracts your attention more is quite an interesting dialogue to have. But the power of social media, the power of technology, and what it can do to create these events like Occupy Wall Street, the Black Lives Matters movement, and then also what's been done for quite a while now, which is this Burning Man festival that congregates out in the desert and then after a week or so dissipates and no longer exists. That sort of temporality of people gathering in space is a byproduct of this that becomes interesting, but how do you begin to capitalize that on a built manifestation? Well, it's something that's been done for a really, really long time, and it's been thought about for a really long time. Since the early 1960s, the Department of Defense instituted the Fallout Shelter, which was kind of curated for the nuclear war attacks that they were impending. So John F. Kennedy famously called for this and said, you too can build it at home with all of the suburban fixations that you'd like for inside the shelter. And that becomes an interesting sort of point to discuss, which is, in anything that you design, there has to be somewhat of a comfortability or somewhat of a parallel that we're thinking about when we're talking about design. Figure 2, the lush drawn house kit of parts. These were homes built primarily after World War II that used a kit of parts, and it was kind of, you knew exactly what you were getting, right? There would be a model home. You could pick certain components that maybe worked for you, but again, there was this familiar element that allowed you to construct the built form that would resonate. And then, of course, the time period that we're in now, van life becoming ever increasingly popular. So again, it's almost like the Fallout Shelter in a way where, it's not protecting you from, a nuclear war, but at the same time, it's allowing you to travel the world in your own isolated way, having the comforts at home, having the comforts of what you tend to think you should have within a van. So as we're talking about all this too, I want to just bring up the fact that we're constantly engaging on this dialogue of design through the individual lens. So again, with each of those examples, what is the individual comfortable with? And then obviously, if you were to travel, from place to place, what does that local knowledge look like? What is someone going to bring into that suburban home or into that van? Having a conservation mentality of the place in which you're doing these things. So obviously looking at land and resource management, the social institutions at play, and then the worldview. So again, using these constructions and assemblies of the social construct, we're looking at ways in which we're kind of gauging our understanding of, place, material, people, social constructs. So it becomes almost a framework in which to gauge how we design and perceive things. And there's no better example of this than comparing the two books, Yes is More by Bjarke Ingels, which was released about 10 years ago now, and then Low Tech, Designed by Radical Indigenism. These are complete opposites in the spectrum of books, in the spectrum of architecture, and the approach and the way that we look at architecture. literally by the title on the left, Yes is More. So it's just talking about that complexity narrative, versus the one on the right is actually arguing that we go back to indigenism, into this place that's, you know, seemingly looking like it's more complex on the right with this bridge that's being carried across by people. But at the same time, there's this elegance to the simplicity and the natural evolution of the object itself. So if we were to take a look at the Radical Indigenism book, you know, even by the graphics themselves, I mean, you could imagine if you were an architect needing to draw or construct that bridge, you really can't, right? It's this natural evolution of time that has created that bridge, not a person out there constructing it. But what's really beautiful about it, and what's sort of interesting in a way, is that we're not looking to the drawings to tell us a simplified version of this. That walking across that itself, you're able to feel things and live in a moment of the intangible that otherwise you wouldn't be able to explore on a piece of paper. Yet, when we're talking about Bjarke Ingels' work, a recent project, now we're looking at an extremely complex building with its main purpose of linking, you know, two land masses over a canal in Norway. And the only way that they're able to present this to us in the simplified version for us to understand is through diagrams. And Bjarke Ingels is really well known for doing these sorts of diagrams, but his buildings are actually extremely complex. And you can simplify the building to 4 easy diagrams, which could be given to the client and said, this is what you get, this is the concept, and ultimately, here we are, this is your design. And what becomes really dangerous with this is that somehow along the way, we've lost this narrative and this dialogue into the process and journey of actually creating, you know, a building that has much more factors than form itself. So form is only one of the characteristics of creating a building. I would actually argue that in the center of this space, which is your bottom right picture and your top left picture, that, you know, by looking at that, we've almost lost touch with the human as you're experiencing that curve and you're having to walk around it. You can see the structure that's up in the left-hand corner there on that left-hand picture that's incorporated to even have this maneuver happen. It becomes a really, really interesting dialogue into what is simple, what is perceived as simple, and then ultimately, how do we define that further for people every day? Of course, some of you may have been here. It's one of the most photographed projects right now, I think, in the world, and it's Luis Paragon's house in Mexico City. If you notice on my first slide, I was up along that pink wall. It's a great pink wall to have your picture taken with. But there's also this narrative, and this narrative has been portrayed by architects forever in about, you know, photographing your work. So Salas Portugal was Luis Paragon's photographer. He photographed all of his work. And I think a lot of people think that architects are designing spaces without these pictures in mind, right? The way that we portray space. And up until recently, you know, this space was not even visitable, right? Like you would have to look at the pictures to understand the space, and that's all you got. And so it's these crafted, curated moments that's done by someone like Salas Portugal with Luis Paragon's work that we innately feed you the information of a built form, which is to go on now and talk about Instagram, which is now we have anybody going anywhere can tell you anything about a space. So whether it's posing against that wall, looking very interesting in front of the whimsical floating wood stairs, or even matching your outfit to talk about the new color palette of what seems like this Gucci outfit in front of the Luis Paragon wall, or interacting with the space in a completely different way that I'm sure Luis Paragon was not interested in having someone pose like that. It brings up the question of, you know, do we actually think about social media as a way of intensifying these spaces beyond what our own conceptions or interpretations of space can be? And it becomes a really important dialogue into design and how architecture is formed, because ultimately what we're doing now is we're inviting the public to gauge and understand our work and outwardly express it to the rest of people. So this idea of trending architecture, or this idea of visual stimuli and creating an architecture to just respond to Instagram, that becomes a dangerous conversation too. it's almost the Pinterest syndrome, which is that we're only creating for that photograph. And so I would argue that maybe the most important takeaway from utilizing social media is actually looking at what people are doing in spaces and building off of that, right? The intangible, unseen moments rather than the ones that are using fuchsia colors or whatnot and directly copying. And that sort of practice and that sort of dialogue is needed, again, to sort of further understand that worldview. As we're talking about worldviews, there's this really, really difficult and unfortunate history of portraying people and ideas. And so the photographs on the left are done by Edward Curtis. He was a photographer who traveled through North America from 1907 to 1930. And he culminated his photographs in the publication known as the North American Today. But unfortunately, what happened was he staged a lot of the photographs with the Native American communities. And what ended up happening is a lot of these photographs were utilized for people to understand their heritage and history. So a lot of the information was wrongly portrayed. So fast forward to 2 years ago in 2018, Matika Wilbur did a project where she tracked all of the tribes down from the original Edward Curtis photographs and rephotographed people in these communities throughout North America. And I think the interesting dialogue is that we have Edward Curtis photographs taken from the Tohono O'odham and that Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community here, wrongly portraying the people. So on the top, you can see this is the landmass of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. And on the bottom, we can see the built and unbuilt land. So to the right is unbuilt land. This is land that does not have any structure of any sort on the 53,000 acre landmass. And then on the left, you can see how they've pretty much zoned their building to the western edge of their landmass. And this is what it looks like. Aerial view. This is Edward Bertinsky's work. This is the SRPMIC reservation nestled up to Scottsdale, Arizona. And so on the right side, you see, you know, I guess the comfortability of the suburb and all its fixings. And to the right, you see the stewardship of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community and their reverence for the land itself and respect for it. What becomes really interesting when we're looking about that suburban movement, and not only our community, but across the world, we have these many, many, many over the last 150 years design eras that have taken place. And when we look to the traditional Native American design era, we have 5. So we were tasked on the Scottsdale Community College project that I had mentioned before with coming up with a building to be placed on a college site, but at the same time pay respect to a disenfranchised Indian community and to a built history and legacy that wasn't quite understood still today because of these photographs that a lot of people were basing their biases on. And so we utilized this in a couple ways. One, we took those photographs and we had a cultural consultant aid us in the understanding of this place, this constant dialogue of understanding the social implications to the built ones. And so what we did is we looked at things like the roundhouse, which was the traditional structure bermed with earth for temperature and climate control in our environment. The vato, which is in the middle, which is an overhanging structure, again, oftentimes placed outside of the roundhouse to create that shade, but also a place of public gathering. And then thirdly, the idea of materiality of using saguaro ribs to actually cast into the wall and create that rigidity that's needed for a barrier between the outdoors. And so through each of those things and each of those studies, there's many, many iterations that ultimately formulated us into the knowledge of modern day society. So on the left, using the earth berming to actually create a 10% peak reduction in the cooling load, utilizing the sort of formal nature of the overhang in the vato to, you know, begin to create a narrative or a form on the building itself in modern day. And then, of course, the materiality of the saguaro inside of the wall. And we utilize these parameters also at at more of a micro scale, looking at Pima pottery shards as a way of communicating this abstracted language on ceiling planes. And then, of course, using the underside of the vato, which is the picture on the bottom right there in black and white, of how do you utilize a wood component with a clerestory above to re-assimilate that idea and into a modern day construction again. And so ultimately this kind of manifests itself from one story very early on in the project, which was a story told to us by our cultural consultants, but also the community members. And this is why it's so important to have an open mind when designing. They were talking to us about the embodiment of the human spirit in a saguaro rib. And so there's this traditional story of a mother losing her child, but ultimately they see the saguaro as the embodiment of the human spirit. And later on, probably a few months later, one of our cultural consultants was talking about how they were burning that morning. And I said, well, why do you burn certain things? I forget what he was burning at the time. It was not a saguaro rib. And he said, well, that is to release the spirit of the human that's embodied in our formal objects. And so I said, well, would you do that with the saguaro rib? And he said, yeah, actually, we oftentimes burn dead saguaro ribs, knowing that it's one of our ancestors, and we release them into the spirit of the heavens. So we took that idea into a material language, again, going back to the very first presentation topic, which was then testing this idea into a tilt concrete panel that was placed on the building that really resonated with the people socially, but then also physically created a new approach to a material method. And ultimately, you can see that process, right, that we're embedding the saguaro rib, and then we're ultimately burning it out. We had a ceremony where we invited the public to come watch this and really pay tribute to their own ancestors as we were doing this. So again, it was creating that identity for the people of the Salt River, Pima, Maricopa, Indian community. That's the final texture. Again, creating something anew, but socially resonant. And then the building itself had two entries, one on the east and one on the west. And on the east, there was a view to Red Mountain, which is their adjacent landmass that's a prominent landmark feature in the Salt River, Pima, Maricopa Indian community. And then on the west side is the campus mall. So you can see, even on the building face itself, between these two entities, the way in which the building is used and identified within the campus space pays tribute to not only its land in which it's located, but at the same time, the people in which you use it, which is a very important part into the dialogue of architecture. There's some other photographs of that building. Again, that textural quality resonating. The way in which the punches and the windows take on our environment, again, with the idea of self-shade. The moment of the saguaro rib paying a reminder in shadow up against the saguaro rib texture. And that area, just where that happens there to the far right, is actually a storytelling space. So it's inviting users to come in, and whether they know or don't know the story of the saguaro rib, are able to tell their own stories of modern day in the inevitability that time is again passing. I'll finish with this slide because I think it's probably one of the most important slides that we talked about and culminates everything that we just discussed: materiality, the social implications of place, the dialogue of architecture in which we understand it. And I think it goes to the far right quote, which is that when we look to the Native American people, we have to understand that they're still here. So Michael Doris said, the Indian by and large is a motif embedded in Americana, not perceived as a part of the American present. A confusion comes when we realize that Indian people, too often mistaken for the Indian, are still very much around. And that's true. We see it in our own backyard, and we understand that there's these differences and contrasts in people constantly, but it's re-engaging that individual perspective to the worldview that's really going to allow us to understand and critically engage our built environment. And this photograph was not staged. It was kind of interesting. We were there on site, and we had invited some community members to come in and use the building in any way they saw fit. And one of the remarkable moments was that, you know, the kids, as we were, you know, asking them to kind of run around and get ready and get dressed, walked over to these triangles that had water running out of them. That water is actually condensate out of our HVAC system. It's a byproduct of the condensing of that water that's then brought out and running down the face of the wall. And to see them play with a byproduct of something that's so intrinsic to our environment, especially during the hot summer months, and sort of this sort of natural play was I think the culmination of everything that we're striving for in the built environment, in design, and an approach to living and understanding the world around us.